The morning they read my grandmother's will, I was the only one in the room who already knew what it said. I had driven 4 hours from Charlotte to get to the Harmon County offices by 9. The building was one of those low-slung civic structures with carpet the color of old mustard and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. I signed in at the front desk, found the room listed on the notice I had received, and sat down at the table on the left side. My coat was still on. My bag was on the floor beside my chair. I folded my hands on the table and waited. My aunt and uncle arrived 8 minutes later with their attorney, a man named Douglas Priel who wore a watch that cost more than my first car. My aunt did not acknowledge me when she walked in. My uncle looked at me the way you look at something you stepped on. They sat across the room and whispered to Priel, and Priel nodded with the practiced patience of someone who had already been paid. I had not spoken to either of them in 3 years. The last time I saw my aunt in person, she told me that I was embarrassing the family by the choices I had made. She said it at Thanksgiving, in front of everyone, while passing the bread rolls. My uncle nodded along. I put my napkin on the table, said I hoped everyone had a good evening, and drove home in the dark. I did not go back. My grandmother's name was Ruth. She had lived her entire life in Harmon County, raised 2 children, buried a husband, and kept a garden so well tended that people used to slow their cars to look at it from the road. She was the kind of woman who said exactly what she thought but never raised her voice to do it. She called me every Sunday for as long as I could remember. Even during the 3 years I kept my distance from the rest of the family, her calls came every week, same time, same warmth. She passed on a Tuesday in February. Her physician called me directly because she had asked him to. The attorney who handled her estate called me the following day. He told me that her will was specific and that my presence would be required at the reading. My aunt and uncle found out within 24 hours. My uncle left a voicemail that lasted 6 minutes. The substance of it was that my grandmother had clearly not been in full possession of her faculties when she drafted the most recent version of her will, that I had manipulated her during her final years, and that any reasonable person could see I had no legitimate claim to anything she owned. He used the word opportunist twice. I saved the voicemail but I did not return it. The estate in question was not extravagant. It was my grandmother's house on Weller Lane, a craftsman bungalow with a deep front porch and a backyard that backed up against a tree line. It was the house where I had spent every summer of my childhood. It was the house where she had taught me to make pie crust and where I had sat on that porch reading until the light ran out. It was not worth what my aunt and uncle believed it was worth. But it was the place that contained the most of her, and I suspect she understood that when she wrote my name into that document. My aunt and uncle hired Douglas Priel approximately 48 hours after the voicemail. Their filing arrived at my apartment by courier on a Thursday afternoon. I was not surprised. I had, by that point, been working for 7 years as a contract compliance specialist for a mid-size federal contracting firm based in Charlotte. My job, in its simplest description, was to review documentation, identify inconsistencies, and build records that would hold up under scrutiny. I did this for a living. I was considered quite good at it. When the filing arrived, I read it the way I would read any contract, carefully, without emotion, noting every claim that could be contradicted and every assumption that had been made without evidence. Then I went to my filing cabinet and began to pull folders. The first time I encountered Douglas Priel outside of that conference room was the morning before the proceeding. He approached me in the parking lot of a diner where I had stopped for coffee. He was cordial in the specific way that attorneys are cordial when they are trying to take something from you without the inconvenience of a formal fight. He told me my aunt and uncle were under considerable financial strain. He told me the house represented meaningful security for them at their stage of life. He told me that an early, voluntary transfer of the property would spare everyone a great deal of unpleasantness. I looked at him for a moment over my coffee cup. I told him I would see him tomorrow. He smiled without his eyes. The proceeding drew more observers than I expected. Harmon County was small enough that a contested estate reading had the quality of an event. The adjudicator was a woman named Claire Vance, early 60s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the expression of someone who had presided over enough family disputes to have lost the capacity for surprise. She arranged her papers. She called the room to order. She gave the proceeding its formal shape. Priel went first. He was methodical. He had clearly prepared. He described my aunt and uncle as the primary caregivers for my grandmother during her final years. He noted that they had accompanied her to medical appointments, managed her household repairs, handled her grocery runs during the period when she could no longer drive. He described me, without using language that was technically objectionable, as someone who had been largely absent, who had removed myself from the family structure, who had, in the months before my grandmother's death, appeared with a renewed interest in maintaining contact that coincided, he implied, with a declining woman's increasing vulnerability. He did not say I had manipulated her. He arranged the details so that the conclusion arrived on its own. My aunt asked to speak next. She stood with the posture of someone who had practiced the night before. She spoke about the years she had given to caring for my grandmother, the weekends, the early mornings, the medical paperwork. None of it was untrue. My aunt had been present in my grandmother's physical life in ways that I, living 4 hours away, had not been. I did not dispute that. But then something shifted in her voice. Something that had been sitting just below the surface of her prepared remarks finally came up through the floor. She turned and looked directly at me. She said that I had always been the difficult one. That I had chosen a life that put distance between myself and the people who had tried to support me. She said my career choices had been erratic and that I had never been able to commit to anything stable. She said that my grandmother had always made excuses for me, that she had always had a soft spot for me specifically, and that this was a known family dynamic that everyone had tolerated for years because no one had wanted to upset Ruth. Then she said that it was a shame that even now, even after everything, I was still looking for someone else to take care of me. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something has been said that cannot be put back. Adjudicator Vance made a note. She did not look up immediately. Priel moved to continue. Vance raised one hand, just slightly, without looking at him. She looked at the folder I had placed on the table in front of me when I sat down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, quietly, that perhaps I would like to submit my documentation for the record. I brought the folder to the clerk. Inside were 7 years of quarterly bank transfer records. Every 3 months, without exception, I had sent my grandmother a transfer. Not large amounts, but consistent. Enough to cover her property tax in full for 4 consecutive years. Enough to cover 2 rounds of exterior repairs that she had mentioned once in passing during our Sunday calls and never brought up again. There was also a folder of correspondence. 81 letters and cards, spanning the 3 years my aunt had characterized as my absence, each one with my grandmother's handwriting in the margins. Her responses to things I had written, her small notations of agreement or amusement or affection. There was also a letter on federal letterhead. I had worked for 3 years on secondment to a division of the Department of Housing and Urban Development as part of a joint compliance review initiative. The letter was from the division director, summarizing the scope of my work and the outcome of the audit cycle I had led. It was not a letter I had originally intended to include. I added it the night before, after I listened to my uncle's voicemail a second time. Priel looked at the federal letterhead the way you look at something that has just rearranged the room. Adjudicator Vance read through the documents with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understood exactly what she was reading. She paused at the transfer records. She cross-referenced 2 of the dates against documents in the estate file. She set the correspondence folder down and picked up the HUD letter. She set her pen down. She looked at Priel. She said, calmly, "Counselor, were you aware of your opposing party's professional background before this proceeding?" Priel said he had understood me to be a private individual working in a general administrative capacity. Vance looked at him for a moment. She said that I had spent 3 years conducting federal compliance audits for a division of HUD, that I had documented every financial contribution I had made to the estate, with corresponding bank records, and that the correspondence file contained 81 pieces of written communication with the decedent across the period characterized this morning as an absence. She paused. She said, without emphasis, that the characterization presented earlier this morning appeared to be working from an incomplete picture. My uncle leaned forward. My aunt turned to look at me. The look on her face was not anger. It was something more disorienting than that. It was the expression of a person who has been certain about something for a long time and has just been handed a reason to doubt themselves. Priel recovered as well as he could. He argued that professional credentials and financial contributions did not, in themselves, determine the validity of a testamentary bequest. He was correct about this. Vance agreed with him and noted it for the record. She also noted, without any particular inflection, that they did speak to the characterization of a person's intentions, and to the accuracy of testimony offered under oath. She said it the way someone says a thing that is simply true and does not require decoration. My aunt said, her voice harder now, that she had not known any of this. that I had never told them, that I had kept all of it private and let everyone believe what they believed. I looked at her steadily across the room. I said, "You didn't ask." 3 words. I did not raise my voice. I did not add to them. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one after her speech. Vance upheld the will. The house on Weller Lane remained mine. The room cleared in the way rooms clear after a proceeding has ended, quickly and without ceremony. Priel gathered his materials and was gone within 5 minutes. The observers filed out. The clerk collected the documents. My aunt and uncle did not leave immediately. I was putting my folder back into my bag when my uncle spoke. His voice had lost the register it had in the voicemail. He asked me what exactly the federal work had involved. He asked it the way you ask something when you are actually trying to understand it rather than win an argument. I told him, not everything, the general shape of it. The audit work, the documentation reviews, the secondment, the years of building a practice that was entirely mine and that had nothing to do with the version of me they had carried in their heads. He listened in the way a person listens when they are quietly revising something they thought was settled. My aunt sat with her hands folded on the table for a moment. Then she said that the things she had said about my career being erratic, about my grandmother making excuses for me, had been unfair. She said it plainly. She did not attach a justification to it or soften it into something easier to offer. She said it was unfair, and that she had said it in a room full of people, and that she understood that. I did not tell her it was fine. It was not fine, but I told her it was acknowledged. I told her that I was going to take some time with the house, that there was work to be done on the porch and the back fence line, and that if they ever wanted to see what my grandmother had left behind, the door was not locked. The following week my aunt arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning with a casserole dish covered in foil. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked around at the house without saying much. She picked up one of my grandmother's ceramic pieces from the shelf by the window and held it for a moment. She set it back down carefully. She asked if there was anything she could do. I handed her a paintbrush. We painted the porch railing together and did not talk about the proceeding. We talked about my grandmother, about the summers, about the specific way Ruth had of making you feel like you were the most important person she had spoken to that week, even when you probably weren't. My aunt laughed at something I said, and for a moment she sounded the way she used to sound when I was a child and the family was a different shape than it had since become. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from physical effort. It is the exhaustion of having carried a version of yourself that other people assigned to you, the version that needed to be managed, accounted for, excused. Setting that down is not dramatic. It does not feel like victory. It feels like taking off a coat you forgot you were wearing and noticing that your shoulders had been up for years. My grandmother used to say that the people who misunderstand you most completely are often the people who love you most incompletely. She said it is not cruelty, usually. It is just a failure of curiosity. The willingness to stop asking questions once you think you have someone figured out. I don't know yet what my aunt and I will build from this. Families that have been quiet for years do not become loud again overnight, and loud does not always mean close. But the house on Weller Lane is mine, and her garden is coming back along the south fence, and on Sunday mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee in a chair that still carries the shape of her, and I think about what it means to be known. If you have someone in your life you are certain you understand, a sister, a parent, a cousin you stopped calling, I want to ask you something. When did you last ask them a question, and then waited, really waited, to hear the answer? Not to respond. Not to correct, just to hear. Because the distance between people is almost never as solid as it looks from one side. It is almost always made of assumptions that were never tested, and questions that were never asked.